Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Judith Butler video 2. In this video, I've got three goals. In the first, I'm going to explore so-called social constructionism as it pertains to gender. Next, I'm going to look at Butler's performativity and give you two examples of that concept. Finally, I'll get you ready for your tutorials. Let's do it. I want to open with a question. What does it mean when we say that gender is fluid? I pose this because I think you have an idea in your head that to say gender is fluid is to say that anything goes, or that we shouldn't be restricted in our thinking about it in heteronormative or cisgendered ways. In this sense, fluidity is the opposite to rigidity. This is sort of what Butler is saying. She doesn't like rigidity any more than you and me. In this video, I want to show you how Judith Butler provides an answer to that question, and the sociological tensions that come up when she formulates gender as such, and sex. This will bring us to the forms of desire and subjectivity discussed in video 1 and expressed in the readings. My job is to put what Butler wrote into plain English. Let's look to the constructionist argument as it pertains to gender and sex. There's no way you've made it this far into sociology without hearing about social constructionism, or this class, since we talked about it, racialization and colonialism. Bringing it up here, I want to talk about what we mean when we say gender is socially constructed. One way of saying that gender is fluid is to say that the category refers not to an inherent attribute within us, but a series of constructions that are culturally organized in the cultures in which we are located. To repeat what was talked about in the post-colonialism lecture, when we say that gender, or anything for that matter, is socially constructed, we suggest a few things. The first is that there is a collective organization to the way that the thing is understood outside of the individual entity. The way that something is received varies in particular conditions. This entails a series of claims about knowledge, history, and reality. In terms of the first, it means that we could know something differently. There is a situated way in which we gain access to the knowledge of things, and with different conditions we learn about an object differently. Think here about the work of anthropologist Margaret Mead. She went to Papua New Guinea and saw that the gender categories used there were quite different than those found in the West. By observing gender in a different setting, we got different results. We can know things other than how they are presented to us, in the case of a socially constructed object, like gender. Second, and related to the first position, is an historical one. If we look throughout time, we will find that things are socially constructed are different than they were before. In terms of the discussion in the post-colonialism lectures, we said that part of the history of empire was the creation of racial categories where they did not exist before. Part of the history of Orientalism was lumping various groups of people into a Middle Eastern category, with its own dynamics that are different than other racial categories. In each of these cases, something has a history on which its existence is contingent. Historical contingency is a phrase people often use here. Then there is the question of reality, and here we need to ask the most questions about constructionism. When we say something is real, we would most often say that it exists outside of how we know it and how we feel about it. So we could say that the ways that we think about and use our bodies vary somewhat depending on culture, but that human bodies have a reality outside of their cultural existence. Representations may differ, but bodies don't. We can call this the natural versus social divide. Butler will argue that the constructionist argument doesn't go far enough, because eventually we get to a point where culture ends and the natural, or the biological, begins. But here we get to some sticky questions. Here's one. Is language real? What about linguistic representations? To what extent are they real? You and I both know that language exists and is real, but how and in what way? This isn't so easily discerned. Or ideas? In each of these cases, there are no clear-cut answers. To say that something is socially constructed seems to suggest that it is less real than a scientific object, something objectively true, but more real than the words we're using to describe it. Now, because Judith Butler reads so much Foucault, the relationships between words and things are a two-way street. It isn't just the language that describes gender and sex that is important, but the ways that our descriptions of things alter the world and change the way others relate to us. I'll explore this further in the next slide. In any case, all social constructionists want to critique some form of essentialism, the belief that things might have a timeless, unchanging essence away from or outside of the impact of the social. When someone is called a gender essentialist or a sex essentialist, or both, the idea is that they support an idea of womanness without which one is not a woman. So looking to social constructionism, we have questions about language and about reality. Finally, I want to think about what we mean by social in social constructionism. If you've been paying attention in this class, you will realize that the term social is by no means settled either. With each different sociological theorist we read, we find a different realm whereby entities are social. Durkheim's social is social facts. Marx's are the material conditions whereby we reproduce the species. What becomes evident is that social doesn't mean much divorced from the greater system in which it's deployed. My argument is that in saying sex and gender are socially constructed, we end up with as many questions as answers. We have a bunch of different questions about what constructionism is and what social means. I would argue the same for gender fluidity. In both cases, we need to know more about the specific argument at hand. Butler's argument, combining Foucault and psychoanalysis, centers around the concept of performativity. Any attempt to divide sex from gender, saying one category is political and the other not, is itself a political act. Thus, both categories are political outcomes. Here I want to outline and show how performativity differs from performance, which will set up the difference between Judith Butler and Erving Goffman. It is not just a mask. It is an institutionally regulated and desiring entity. Gender is made as it is done, mixing the discursive elements Foucault pushed us towards and the flows of desire mapped by Freud and his followers. When we think about performing gender, we think about the ways that we act out things as a man or as a woman. Butler is, of course, addressing these moments as gendered moments, where we make sense of gender by acting it out. In this sense, like Goffman, Butler is arguing that gender is a performance. However, she means a great deal more than that. Butler argues that gender and sex are indexical. When we say that a term is indexical, we mean that its meaning is found in how it is used in a set of practices. Think of the expression, It gains its meaning only in a particular moment in everyday life. Butler is saying the same thing about the sex and gender binary. She argues that whenever we talk about biological sex versus social gender, we are constituting those two terms in opposition to each other. So gender isn't just established as not biological. We are also establishing the meaning underpinning biological in rejecting it. The argument here is that sex and gender are the products of discourse and desire, the outcome of action by you and me, and are, in this sense, ethical. Butler is going to argue that our attempts to divide biology from the social in terms of social constructionism are themselves the product of discourse. So, if your bigoted uncle at Thanksgiving dinner says, regardless of what society you look at, you'll always see that men are stronger than women, and this is because of biology, this too counts as discourse in the Foucauldian sense. This will become clear as we look to Butler's book, Bodies That Matter. The book is a combination of Foucault and Freud. Butler says yes, according to Foucault, gender and sex are the products of discourse, human-made categories that we use to divide the world up. She is also arguing that the gender binary is the product of a particular discourse on sex and gender. Finally, she also wants to ask how we come to desire particular sex and gender categorizations and gendered bodies. Here, Foucault doesn't offer us much help, but psychoanalysis does. In Bodies That Matter, Butler wants to show that the material and ethical coalesce in discourse. One of her goals is to see how feminist discourses, particularly on queer folk, reproduce exclusionary understandings of sex, gender, and desire. Following queer desire, against the grain of the sex and gender binary helps us reorient feminist theory. This is Foucauldian insofar as it is discursive and follows his post-structuralist philosophy. It differs from him in that he looks mostly to what is done to the body, whereas Butler wants to theorize the body's active desires. This means looking to psychoanalysis and to queer existence. So Butler's argument is that sex and gender are the products of discourse, and we can't easily divide the two. Let me give you an example. When making fun of Jack Astor's in the Bourdieu videos, I did a bad impression of a server being nice to old guys in order to get their tips. In this example, there is an assumption about the forms of desire that each participant ought to have, and the kinds of bodies that their desire flowed through. One desiring, one desired. Both actors heterosexual by logical necessity. This is gendered. This is a case of compulsory heterosexuality, where, in order to participate in my scenario, the two were included only in terms of their supposed relationship to each other. Here, Butler wouldn't just take objection to my example, but all forms of knowledge that place gender and desire on normative paths that ignore queer bodily existence. The argument isn't just that we shouldn't gender people. The argument is that feminist theory, and many other types of theory, are institutionalized discourses that posit gender orientations onto subjects. Butler argues that discourse doesn't just end at gender. Sex, too, is a discursive product. This applies to biology, and it applies to feminist theory. Next, I want to look at the limits of the performance metaphor. Here's Harry Styles' Vogue cover from not so long ago. It caused a big internet stir when it came out. I want to look at this instance as a limit of the performance metaphor. When we think about gender being fluid, we think that we can do anything with gender. Look at the quote that Harry has there on the cover. Anytime you're putting barriers up in your life, you're limiting yourself. Harry Styles makes his own rules. I want to argue, with Butler's Foucauldian influences, that this passes over three things. First, it passes over the sex-gender relation. In saying this is one with typically male characteristics wearing a dress, we are still constituting what counts as a male. Next, it overlooks power relations. We are still talking about a world where patriarchy exists. Not just anybody can be gender fluid. Not just anybody can be Harry Styles. Finally, it also overlooks the ways that discourses in magazines like Vogue constitute gender. We're not freely able to be whatever gender we want in all instances. In many cases, as Foucault argues, gender is disciplinary. It is acted upon us. So, of course, Judith Butler is going to fully celebrate anybody following any course of desire that they'd like, so long as it is lawful and safe. But we also have to think about the oppressive conditions and the gendered conditions in which many of us dwell. Gender is performed, yes, but often in inhospitable or oppressive conditions. Don't forget that. Did you guys notice the title of that slide? Gendered styles. Okay, in your tutorials this week, you're going to do the last of the outline assignments. Introductions. With your TA, you're going to review the pretty difficult concepts we looked at this week, and then you're going to organize them into an introduction. Every introduction I've ever written has been exactly the same. And conclusion. I'll see you next week.